Small Town Monsters, how many films have you done?
The Mothman Legacy is our 10th, but because of COVID, we were filming the 11th as we were wrapping up the 10th. So we've just finished post-production on the 11th. So total films is 11, total mini series. We have 3 other mini series. So we're at basically 13, 14 productions now.
I think this is your best one of the ones that I've seen. It's
Oh,
really
wow.
so. Tell me about the genesis of the film. I mean, this is right in your wheelhouse. This story. It's been told before. So, what did you set out to do? What did you want to do with it?
Yeah, I think when we were making, so we had made a movie that looked at that classic Mothman story back in 2017. And during the press run for that movie, everyone kept asking if we were going to do a sequel. And I had always said no, because to me, the Mothman story was what we had just made. It was that 66, 67 flap of sightings. It was the collapse of the Silver Bridge. And I didn't see there being much of a story beyond that. But in making that movie, releasing that movie, and then the subsequent 3 years since it came out, we've met numerous people claiming to be witnesses. And I knew going into this that we had enough people, enough witnesses that we could talk to about sightings, and that the sightings ran the gamut of what people were encountering. It wasn't all just like one type of event. However, what really got me interested was when I started learning about the Scots-Irish immigrants that came over and sort of settled Appalachia, the Appalachian immigrants, the Native American, the First Nations people that lived in the area, how their culture, how their legends maybe play a role in the Mothman story today. And that was what, the evolution of storytelling, I guess, is what drew me to the movie.
Yeah, it's great. That's really a great part where you show the melding of legends from these different cultures, the First Nations culture, and then the Scotch-Irish immigrants, because there is crossover there.
Yeah. Yeah, that was, I thought, if I can, the thing of it is, when you're making these movies, we've done 11 movies, and at a certain point, we make so many per year, you're trying to find a hook. I mean, you probably know this better than anyone. You're trying to find a hook that might grab your attention as much as the reader or the viewer's attention. And that's what got me. My dad's family were from North Carolina. They're from the deep Appalachian roots. I mean, in my dad's side of the family. So I felt that, pull when I was coming to this, just that look into the history of the area, and to deny the similarities between something like a banshee, or the screech owl stories, and the similarities between those and the Mothman would be disingenuous. And that's really what drew me to it.
Let's start with the central event surrounding the Mothman event. For those who don't know the story, Point Pleasant, 1967, something terrible happens, and the Mothman sort of plays a central role before and after. Tell that.
Yeah, I mean, the story that draws people to the Mothman is the 1967 wave of sightings. It starts in November of 1966 when 2 couples are driving outside of the TNT area, just outside of Point Pleasant, West Virginia. They encounter this glowing, red-eyed, winged humanoid creature standing on the side of the road. It chases them in their car. It speeds up to 100 miles per hour. They race back to town. They report the incident to police. And then, as it tends to go, local media picks up on the story. The story hits newspapers across the country, and all of a sudden, other people come in with similar sightings around the area. And we learn about a history that goes back possibly to the 1930s of Birdman-like creatures around Point Pleasant, West Virginia. But during that 66 wave, you have up to 200 witnesses of the Mothman. And that's going off of what John Keel said. That's how many people he claimed to interview while he was writing his seminal book, The Mothman Prophecies. You've also got a UFO wave that's sweeping across West Virginia. And even though that wave didn't start in 66, it had been going on since the 50s. You've got this extensive period of time where people are seeing UFOs, and especially during that time period. You've got sort of a peak that happens there. Then you also have the appearance of mysterious men in black around Point Pleasant and much of Appalachia in general, sort of coinciding with the Mothman sightings and the UFOs. And then everything seems to be cascading towards something. We're racing towards some sort of an endpoint. And in 1967, December of 1967, December 15th to be specific, the Silver Bridge spanning the Ohio River from Point Pleasant into Gallipolis across the river collapses into the Ohio River during rush hour, and 46 people are lives. 46 lives are lost. And that, to most people, that's it. That's the end of the Mothman story. But obviously it's not the truth. It's just the most well-known chapter in that story.
The big picture, looking back at it, during the disaster, and you do a great job telling that story. In the immediate aftermath of the disaster, people are dealing with the consequences of all this loss of life, and they're not thinking about Mothman. Later, it occurs to people maybe Mothman was a harbinger of doom, that he was trying to tell us something was going on. That's the story that's explored in Keel's books and in the later movie, right?
Yeah, and one thing you always have to mention about Point Pleasant and Gallipolis is they're small towns. Point itself is tiny. So anyone dies in that town, they're more than likely related to someone. So you've got 46 people dying that are connected to everyone. Everyone feels this when it happens. And in some ways, when you talk to people there today, some people that I've spoken to believe that the Mothman may, or whether or not it actually had any sort of relation to the bridge collapse, people had something they could either blame it on or something they could pay attention to other than the loss of a life. So there became this idea with the release of John Keel's book in the 70s that, the Mothman was a harbinger. He was there to warn people of oncoming tragedy and death. And I think when you watch the movie, there's a connection there between the banshee, which is this being that has glowing red eyes, that appears before tragedy and death, that heralds the oncoming disaster, and the Mothman, who does essentially the same thing despite looking different from what we connect with a typical banshee. So does that come about because of the culture of the region, or does it come around because of John Keel's impact on that story with his release of the Mothman prophecies? Those are things that I'm very excited about when we get into this story. But there's this history of winged beings that herald disaster. Even when you get into something like the Thunderbird was typically said to precede disasters. You've got the Garuda, and one of John Keel's early titles for the Mothman prophecies was the Year of the Garuda. So there's been a connection between the Mothman and these winged entities going all the way back to when Keel was looking into this. But Point Pleasant itself, I mentioned this a minute ago, but Point Pleasant itself has a connection to a winged being that supposedly preceded tragedies. You can find it. A local professor named James Gay Jones, who was at least he was not an accredited folklorist, but he was something of a folklorist, wrote about a being that was talked about around Point Pleasant during the 1930s that they referred to as the Birdman. And this was a being that supposedly, preceded barns burning down and floods happening and things like that. So there's a long history of this in that area.
And people will hear those stories and think, oh, that's quaint. Look at that folklore. Look at the mythology, some of which bleeds over in the Native American legends in the area, and not take them seriously. But there are so many hundreds of witnesses to one form of this being or another that it really does need to be taken seriously.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that the impact of these stories on our history, you can't demean that. It's a big part of West Virginia. It's a big part of there's something here. There's something with these winged creatures that might speak to our need to understand tragedy. And I think that's something that I've started to learn in my frequent trips back to Point Pleasant. Is today you go into Point Pleasant and they have historical figures. They have these statues of historical figures that line the flood wall. but yet in the centerpiece of the town, the dead center of the city square, you have the Mothman statue instead of all these historical figures. And there's there's something going on there, that speaks to a human need to understand these tragedies.
Your film, of course, touches on two giants in the field of paranormal research, UFO research, Gray Barker and John Keel. Tell our audience who Gray Barker was, what he's known for, and then we'll get into the story of Keel and his central role in this tale.
Yeah, Gray Barker was a West Virginia author, investigator, researcher, and I do not fashion myself in any way a Gray Barker expert. He's one of those guys that fascinates me, but I also understand it's a very complicated history with Gray Barker, and it's one that I need to spend more time on. But one thing you can't sort of sweep under the rug is he had an impact and a role in some of the biggest ufology cases, cryptid cases, unusual paranormal history around the state of West Virginia that there are. You've got the Grafton monster, you've got his role in the Flatwoods monster story from 1952, as well as the Mothman. He wrote a book that actually preceded Keel's book called The Silver Bridge, that looked at the Mothman sightings and the collapse of the Silver Bridge that took place in Point Pleasant.
And he was a central figure in the whole story of Men in Black.
Right, yeah.
As Men in Black, you have a journalist that you chronicle in your film who had an encounter with him. It's not something made up.
Yeah, Mary Heyer was a local reporter for the Athens Messenger, and her and Keel were sort of intertwined. They spent all this time during 66 and 67 looking into the UFO sightings and the Men in Black and the Mothman reports. In 1967 or something, it might have even been after, I can't quite remember, Mary actually was visited by a Man in Black in her Point Pleasant office. And one of my favorite things to do when I go to Point Pleasant is to go down there to her office. Her office still sits there. The sign is still out front, and pay homage to her, because her role in the Mothman story has kind of been underplayed over the years. I don't know if it's just because she's not a paranormal name, she was simply a local reporter, but her role in the Mothman story is probably greater than Keel or Barker's, in that she did so much to document all the local sightings that happened. And I know a lot of people who've spent time looking into the Mothman story who turn to her newspaper articles more than they do some of Keel's writing or Barker. She wrote a newspaper column called Where the Waters Mingle, and that turned into this constant stream of UFO sighting reports and Mothman activity reports. It's really fascinating to go through that stuff.
It could be a film for you in the future just by herself. I mean,
yeah.
She was there. I mean, she's boots on the ground. She knows the locals. People would talk to her and tell her stories that maybe they would not tell to John Keel, an outsider who came in.
Yeah, I think her role in the end, Keel leaves. So Keel leaves in 67 and doesn't really come back. He doesn't journey back to Point Pleasant at any point until the movie comes out in 2002. So during this time period from 1967 until the very early 1970s, when she passed away, it was just Mary Heyer that was capturing all this. And there were people in town that would turn to her who wouldn't tell a thing to John Keel or Gray Barker, but she's a local, she lives in town, she's someone who they can trust. And because of that, she becomes almost like a clearinghouse for UFO reports around Point Pleasant.
Talk a little bit about John Keel. Again, for our listeners who are not familiar with him, he is a giant in this field. I mean, he was a world traveler. He was absolutely courageous. He pursued strange stories all over the planet, had some experiences of his own that were very disturbing, and became interwoven into the events surrounding Mothman. And it's still underway. He's still a central part of the story.
Yeah, I think Keel plays the biggest role historically in the Mothman story, despite the fact that Heyer and Barker both have their own roles to play. Keel becomes woven into the fabric of that story, into what we know of as the Mothman story. he journeys to Point Pleasant in 1966. He's, as far as I understand it, he was actually on an assignment from Playboy magazine to write an article about UFOs at the time. Comes to Point Pleasant and ends up doing this story about the Mothman that's seen around town and the UFO activity taking place. And he never, at a certain point, he started trying to distance himself. He puts out this book, The Mothman Prophecies, and I think it's 1975 that he releases that book. I can't automatically draw that to my memory, but he puts out the Mothman Prophecies book. And for a while, he tried to keep his distance from the Mothman story. I think, it's interesting with Keel. You can't tell if it's just he has other stuff he wants to do, other stories he wants to tell, other things he wants to investigate, or if he was at a point in his life where he didn't think he would ever come up with the answers for any of it. And so he just was done. Like, he was moving on. He had said everything he had to say about the Mothman. But in 2002, they put out this movie, the Richard Gere movie. And I think in a way it salvaged the whole thing for him. Like, all of a sudden people had a great appreciation for the work he had done, which had become overlooked by that point in time. As far as I understand it, his work into the Mothman case had become, just something that was swept under the rug in a way. So he returned to Point Pleasant and was treated almost as a celebrity around town at that point in time. And he died in the early 2000s, but I don't think he ever escaped the Mothman. It was always looming over him.
Well, it messed with him. I mean, he got phone calls that were pretty creepy. I think, Keel scholars would say this thing, he was fearless, but this really did mess with him. And he realized he had tapped into something that was really strange.
Yeah, the book really gets into all of that. I mean, there's a reason it's called. I think in a weird way, we almost forget the reason why it's called the Mothman Prophecies, and that's that he's getting these phone calls that are sort of prophesying oncoming disaster, oncoming tragedies, and it's one of those things where he becomes extremely paranoid. He talked about it later in life. He became paranoid as to what might be going on. He had other investigators messing with him too around this time, including Gray Barker. So he's dealing with everything connected to this Mothman case, and then he's dealing with other people almost hoaxing him and messing with him on the phone. And then like, he's also, I get the impression that Keel genuinely wanted to understand what was happening. And he formulated theories and hypotheses on what might be happening. In a way, he was doing that simply to satisfy the people who would constantly ask him what he thought was happening. But you have to believe that at some point he wanted to know. Like, he had a desire to understand what was taking place in Point Pleasant, and he tried to tie everything together in a way with that ultra terrestrial theory, and that was his. In our movie, Richard Hatem does such a great job of explaining that theory, but it's, it goes a little beyond just like an interdimensional portal concept. We've heard that before. This is a little deeper than that. And I think I've always got the impression that's him trying to make heads or tails of what was happening.
Well, the problem with the movie, I mean, it was a good movie. I liked it. It wasn't a big hit, as you note in your film. The problem with it is there is no real nice, neat story arc. You can't just tie it up in a bow and, okay, that's the answer to Mothman, because we don't have answers. We still don't have answers. It reminds me of Skinwalker Ranch in the sense that there's no one size fits all explanation for what goes on there.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's funny, in doing the press for this film, the question you get asked the most is, do you believe in Mothman? And I have to say, what are we talking about? Like, which Mothman are we talking about? Because the sightings, the encounters from 66 up to present day, they run the gamut of what people are seeing. The physical descriptions of the Mothman that people give aren't all aligned. It's not all the same thing. And I think we're probably dealing with multiple explanations for what is going on. End of the day, I do believe that there is a paranormal or supernatural aspect to the Mothman story. and the Mothman as a creature. I think there's something going on there beyond just sandhill cranes and giant owls and all of those things you hear so often. But I do think those all play a role, and together you've got something much bigger than than something that we can simply, like you said, tie together with a bow and say, well, here you go. Here's the Mothman. This is what it is.
I thought, the film is beautifully shot, really conveys a sense of that special place in Appalachia there, and the scenery and the rivers, and but the most powerful part for me are the witnesses, the interview. This people you interview who are in the town, who tried to collect information, the guy at the museum, people who were actual witnesses to see Mothman when they were younger. That's really powerful for me, and you get the sense that people it's waxed and waned interest in the topic. For a lot of people, they don't want to talk about it. It stems back to a tragedy that was painful to resurrect, and others who are not quite sure, did Mothman cause this disaster, or was he warning us about it, or what? And that's still unresolved as well, right?
Yeah, and I think people there are wrestling with even embracing the Mothman as a cultural figure of the town, but certainly witnesses are. We were just talking about this yesterday, and I think what it is I was actually talking about it with Richard Haddam yesterday, and so what I told him, and kind of what we agreed on, is there's almost I hate to use the term because it's almost a PTSD for some of these witnesses, where for the remainder of their lives, they're wrestling with what they've seen, whether or not it was real, whether or not they should ever discuss this. And then they have the fact that now Mothman's sort of a kitschy pop figure around West Virginia, so there's this, it's not an easy thing for a witness to talk about. We had, one of the most interesting aspects of the movie to me is the way in which some of the witnesses are so matter of fact about their sightings that it's almost like they're recounting what they had for dinner the night before. And I've heard that from other people, that as a negative, like, well, the film, this witness is so boring. And to me, there's something very believable about a witness who has lived with this event for so long that when they tell you about it, it's just like walking across the street the day before or whatever. It's just a piece of their story. It's a piece of their life.
Where do people see this movie? And I mean, it's perfect for Halloween. It's perfect for any time. I want to encourage people to watch it because it's really good. Where do they see it? How do they get it? And what's next for you?
It's on all major VOD platforms, so iTunes and Amazon and Google Play and all that kind of stuff. Basically anywhere you stream or purchase movies, and then DVD and Blu-ray at smalltownmonsters.com. Next for me, we actually leave on Monday of next week. We're going back to West Virginia. We're making a movie called On the Trail of UFOs, Dark Sky, with my friend Shannon LeGros. So we're working on that next. And then beyond that, we've got On the Trail of Bigfoot, The Journey. And then we have another sort of similar to Mothman movie coming out next summer called Howl of the Rougarou. So we've got a busy 2021 coming up, and a busy remainder of this year as well.
I thought it was cool in the sense that you share with your audience the idea that Mount Pleasant or Point Pleasant has come sort of full circle on Mothman. They've sort of embraced it. I don't know if that's true for everybody in town, but the statue, the museum, I don't know. They have a festival, a Mothman festival.
Yeah, I mean, they do. They have a festival that draws over 15,000 people each year. It's the biggest. It's the second biggest event in the state as far as a tourist draw. I mean, I was just in Point Pleasant 2 weeks ago, and I got to talk to Jeff Walmsley, and he told me they're going through what is their biggest attendance year at the museum in its history. So while we were there in the middle of COVID-19, there's a steady stream of people going into this place and walking up and down the streets of Point Pleasant. And I've said this before, and I know there'd be residents of Point Pleasant who would bristle at this, but the Mothman rescued that town from economic collapse, Because if you're aware of any town in the Ohio Valley, any small town in the Ohio Valley, probably any small town almost anywhere right now, they're all struggling. So when you can have something that will draw people in like that, the value of the Mothman goes far beyond just a culture, cultural thing or a folklore thing. In Point Pleasant, it's become an economic boon that was desperately needed.
Well, that's awesome. Seth, great talking to you. Best of luck with the film. It's terrific. I encourage people to see it. And we'll put some links on our website to the museum and to your film, and hope we'll talk again soon.
Yeah, thanks so much.